Hello and welcome to the FI Newscast, where we bring you relevant news in the food and beverage industry. Today is Friday, May 19th, 2023. We have a great show for you today. Our special guest is Anne-Marie Roerink, president of 210 Analytics. We're going to get into insights on all things grocery, produce, deli, bakery, you name it, she knows about it. But first, we're going to cover some of the top stories from this week that we think are worth a second look. We start off with consumer sentiment, which is unsurprisingly on a downward trend. The University of Michigan released preliminary numbers on its consumer sentiment index, which showed that all three categories were down: consumer sentiment, confidence in current economic conditions, and consumer expectations, which you can see here in this graph. This is the sixth month that consumer sentiment has been down. Surveys of Consumers Director 𝗟𝗲𝘁 cited that the reason for the decline in numbers was mainly the ongoing debate in Washington over the debt ceiling. She says, quote, "If policymakers fail to resolve the debt ceiling crisis, these dismal views over the economy will exacerbate the dire economic consequences of default. We'll see if there are any changes when we see final numbers released next week." We turn next to retail sales, where the Census Bureau released latest numbers. Retail and food service sales for April were up slightly by 0.5% as opposed to the 0.7% decrease last month. Food services and drinking places were up 9% from the previous year. The Bureau adjusted numbers for seasonal variation, holiday and trading day differences, but not for price changes. In a similar positive pattern, organic food sales proved to have a good year in 2022, reaching upwards of $60 billion. Grocery sales grew by 5%, while food services and drinking places grew by 15%. In the earnings world, some good news to report in QSR and CPG. Jack in the Box Inc. seemed to have a good quarter with positive numbers in revenues, same-store sales, and margins. The fast food giant expressed confidence for the rest of the fiscal year, stating a commitment to continued expansion of its chains. The company has multiple development deals in Mexico and is planning to open both Jack in the Box and Del Taco franchises in Montana and Wyoming for the first time ever. Fruit maven Dole plc had a strong quarter of their own, reporting growth in the first quarter despite low volumes in pineapple, cherries, berries, and grapes. Dole recently announced the sale of their fresh vegetable division to Fresh Express, and they plan to work on regulatory aspects of the sale in the next quarter. Going overseas, a sigh of relief for those monitoring the Black Sea Grain Pact. Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan announced that the deal has been extended for 2 more months. The news comes as Russia had been threatening to pull out of the deal due to challenges with its grain and fertilizer exports. Despite the good news, Ukraine still finds it harder and harder to export grain as transportation challenges remain in the Black Sea corridor. Ukraine says that Moscow has been slowing the export pace on purpose, and ship inspections are consistently delayed. And finally, an exciting development for children with peanut allergies around the world. Biopharmaceutical company DBV Technologies has been working on a patch that could help ease peanut allergy symptoms. It's called Viaskin Peanut, and it's a circular patch that's worn between the shoulder blades. The company conducted year-long trials on children ages 1 to 3, and 68% of them reported being able to safely eat more peanut protein than before. There is a current study still being conducted on kids ages 4 to 11 years old. And those are your top stories. We're going to turn now to our special guest. She is the president of 210 Analytics, a market research firm specializing in food retail. She follows trends in the marketplace from seafood to deli, meat to produce, candy to bakery. She is the author of numerous research reports and was named a top woman in grocery in 2022. She is Anne-Marie Roerink. Anne-Marie, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I'm a big fan of the show, and I'm honored to be on it.
Well, we at the Food Institute are a big fan of yours. You always have the latest when it comes to grocery. And I also want to point out your fabulous earrings, these cheeseburger earrings. Is that right?
That's right. Yes. Gotta, live in style, right?
Exactly. Live in style and live in context. Your work is in food and you wear food. I love it. All right. We're going to get right into it. Tell me about grocery. Let's start it off with the meat category. Anne-Marie, what have you been seeing this past quarter in meat sales? Lamb, chicken, pork, beef. Give it to us straight. What have you been seeing?
Well, you mentioned consumer confidence and it's down. We know that 95% of consumers are worried about the level of inflation, and that worry is really translating in a wide variety of money saving measures relative to buying groceries. And meat isn't isolated from that, seafood isn't, produce isn't. People are really constantly balancing time with money, and that's really what we're seeing in every single category, meat included. So in the first quarter, we saw some interesting happenings, and that is the fact that both beef and pork, and a little bit in lamb as well, had deflation for once. And typically, what we see happening is it takes consumers a little bit to realize that prices are a little bit more favorable than they were. But now, a couple of months into seeing more favorable pricing, we actually see consumer dollars shifting accordingly. So typically in recessionary times or inflationary times, you see chicken do really well. Well, the issue with chicken has been that it has double-digit 15 to 20% inflation there for a long time. So now consumers are really looking for, well, what else is a good protein to buy that is affordable? Well, eggs isn't it? As we know, eggs are at a record high. In fact, for the first time in our lifetimes, eggs are more expensive than beef. So what we're seeing is grinds coming up really, really strong. Ground beef is incredibly large. It's more than a third of total beef sales. And people are starting to realize that deflation is giving them a couple of different options. So they're looking for versatility. They're looking for some smaller pack sizes. They're looking for ways to stretch the meat dollar. And all of that has really resulted in continued strong dollar sales that are on par with prior year levels, but a little bit of volume pressure. And that's really what we're seeing across the entire store.
And I'm curious to know, Anne-Marie, from in your opinion, with the warmer weather coming up, we're seeing Memorial Day weekend coming up, summer is around the corner. Is that going to create any change in sales and consumer spending patterns, or is it, due to the economic conditions currently, is that going to, continue to dampen consumer spending on meat?
So what we're seeing relative to the kickoff of grilling season, Memorial Day, that really kicks off 13 weeks of a more outdoor focused entertaining pattern, is that a lot of people are looking to celebrate once more. So of course, we're coming off of 3 years where COVID still had a little bit of an impact the last 2 years on people getting together with friends and family, entertaining outside of the immediate household. Much of that has eased quite a bit. So we are expecting that as the weather is more favorable to being outside, people want to get together with friends and family. Eating out, of course, is still very expensive compared to some of the other solutions that people have. At the end of the day, there's always a big difference between that spend out of home, especially if you look at the drinks, the desserts, and the total bill compared to being at home. So I think we're going to see solid sales in the meat department relative to grilling. And that's where retailers have gotten really, really creative. So you'll see cross merchandising displays where you see cheese and buns and meat all put together in one area. You see seafood that's already on kebabs, ready to grill, to bring a different category into that grilling occasion. And that's really where it's at. It's really not a race to the bottom. It's an opportunity for retailers to be a solution in a time where people are looking for something different, entertaining at home, and everything else.
That's a great point you mentioned just there, that cross merchandising. I want to dovetail off of the meat market. Let's go into the alternative meat market. For example, we know that Beyond Meat recently, it's been reported that they are seeking more millions in another round of PE funding. Anne-Marie, what are you seeing on the ground in terms of consumer reaction to alternative meat? Where are we in that?
I remember talking to the president of the Food Institute, 3-4 years ago when we saw triple-digit growth in the meat alternative market. And I mentioned saying to him, in my opinion, this is growth on what I call a pinprick. And we have to keep math in mind, right? When you have something really small, it's easy to get triple-digit growth. In addition, growth was based on distribution. What we mean by that, that's the geek term for saying there is still a lot more stores that are offering it, or they're expanding their assortment. Well, if you didn't offer meat alternatives last year, but you do this year, by extension of that idea, you're going to have very high growth because you didn't have anything last year. So what I said to Brian at the time was, I still believe that this is something where we need to wait a little bit, wait until we can see the trees through the forest. And I think ultimately this is going to come out as a niche offering, much like organic or some of the other niche segments that we're seeing in the protein department. And I remember at the time we were joking, he goes, that's not a popular opinion, right? That's not what a lot of people think will happen. I said, well, that's my opinion and I'm sticking to it. So fast forward 3 years, what we're seeing is that household penetration of plant-based meat alternatives has peaked out at about 11%. And of all the people that have bought it, we see that 60% only buys it once. And that's a very difficult way to grow a category. You have to have higher household penetration than that, and you have to have a higher repurchase rate. So I think plant-based companies have done a lot of things right. They've kept prices the same. They've done a lot of promoting. But I think where we're struggling is that taste profile. At the end of the day, a good price, a good story, wanting to do better for the environment, wanting to do better for health, that's what gets people to buy it the first time. But if the family rejects it, if it's not a great meal, then people are not going to buy it a second time. And I think a lot of meat alternative companies realize that, and they are very much working on something that has a cleaner label to actually reflect that better for you choice a little bit more. And they're working on taste, they're working on smell and texture. So at the moment, not looking good for plant-based meat alternatives. They've been down double digits in sales for about 2 years now. But I do believe that we're not at the end of the road of the innovation. And we're going to continue to see a lot of movement in that space.
Right. Let's move on to another category in grocery, produce. It looks like we have been seeing some deflation there. Has that driven up demand? What have you been seeing with the consumers in regards to fresh vegetables, fresh fruits, Anne-Marie?
You know, you mentioned deflation, and that's a really interesting thing, because what we typically see with consumers is they don't immediately realize that prices are better. And so fruit has seen some deflation now for several months, but initially it wasn't really resulting into better unit or volume sales, so pound sales. Now what we saw in the April results that just came out this week is that we saw continued deflation in fruit, and volume is actually starting to be up 2% year over year. And now that increase in fruit was able to pull the total fresh produce department back into black. And that's something we had not seen for about 20 months. So that was a really exciting development. And you know, what I would tell all retailers and people involved in the fresh produce department is, you know, help yourself. You know, I was walking around in a store in England during the time where they have had very high beef inflation. And to my surprise, with all my years of walking stores and taking pictures, I saw a shelf tag there that I'd never seen before. And that was a shelf tag referencing the price of ground beef to say we are now 36% cheaper than we were in November of the prior year. And that really is such a great call out to remind folks that, hey, maybe you were no longer buying X, Y, or Z because it was priced out of your range. But keep in mind, prices are more favorable now. And that's really where I think a lot of retailers have been so much more creative in fresh produce and beyond. I'm seeing mix and match sales. I'm seeing smaller and larger packages. I see that favorable price point of produce mixed up with meat, where you can buy 5 different things for $20. And that might be a stuffed potato, some stuffed mushrooms, some meat, all mix and match so that people can put an entire meal together and retailers can leverage that good price point from produce to provide an entire meal at a better cost. So good news there for produce in the recent months.
Again, love what you just brought up there. Grocers, retailers being more creative, thinking outside the box, doing that mix and matching to entice consumers. Thanks for those insights. Well, we're going to take a quick commercial break, but when we come back, we're going to have more with Anne-Marie Roerink of 210 Analytics. Stay with us. right, we are back with Anne-Marie Roerink, president of 210 Analytics. She's been giving us all the latest scoops on grocery, and we're going to get right back into it. Anne-Marie, let's talk frozen foods. I saw in your reports that they had a little bit of a struggle. That sector had a little bit of a struggle in the beginning of this year. Has demand been better this quarter? Talk to me.
You know, frozen food had an incredible 2020. And the other thing to keep in mind is that about 30% of Americans expanded their freezer capacity at home. So they bought another freezer fridge combination, maybe a chest freezer. And so consumers are leveraging freezing altogether as a way to be able to buy family packs or BOGOs, not waste any food so that their money goes to good use. And that also means that frozen food was incredibly popular in 2020. And we actually saw a narrowing of gaps in the demographic. So what I mean by that is a lot of the older generations think of frozen food as the good old TV dinner, and they associate it with sodium and processed, and they're not big fans of frozen food because it's not fresh. And in a way, there was a little bit of shaming even that if you bought a frozen meal, that was just the lazy way out for your family sort of thing. But what we're seeing among millennials is that frozen food are actually quite a favorite. A lot of millennials are the core shoppers of frozen food. They believe it's healthy. They believe it's convenient. It allows them to figure out the meal at 4 p.m., pull out what they need, etc. But it also means that frozen had incredibly high spikes to go up against. And so, yes, while frozen food is down year on year, and we're seeing pressure on units and volume and everything else, if you compare it to the pre-pandemic levels, frozen is still doing extremely well. I'm actually quite bullish on the eventual outcome for frozen food. They've had a lot of issues with supply, with inflation. So, people are just mixing and matching all their solutions. And that includes not only some of the semi and fully prepared items with items they cook from scratch, but it also includes mixing frozen with fresh. For instance, they might buy a frozen pizza and add fresh mushrooms and maybe some diced onions or extra cheese on that pizza. So it's not always about being the full solution. And certainly we continue to see a lot of strength in some of those categories, including frozen meat, etc. So still quite optimistic for that department. Yes.
My mother-in-law would definitely join you in that sentiment. One of her many pieces of advice to me is always buy frozen vegetables, convenient, still just as healthy as fresh. So yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for those insights, Anne-Marie. Let's get into seafood. I know that category has had some struggle in the past. What have you been seeing in this sector? Have they been able to cope with things like price increases, volume unit challenges? What have you been seeing there?
Yeah, very similar to frozen. What we saw in 2020 was a huge surge of seafood. Now, seafood is very unique in the sense that half dollars were always coming from the restaurant side and the other half of dollars were grocery. So they always had a very big presence in food service. And the reason for that was a lot of people do not like to prepare seafood because of the smell in the home. A lot of people are intimidated by preparing seafood in the home as well. And so when, of course, early in the pandemic, there was much less restaurant engagement, we saw a lot of that dollar move to the retail sector. So there were high hopes that maybe people now had figured out how to prepare seafood at home, that barrier had gone away. Maybe they had figured out to use their outdoor grills for some of the seafood as well. And so there was really a lot of optimism in the marketplace that maybe this was finally the time where seafood was going to break through. Well, in reality, what we saw is that lasted about 1 year, and a lot of the sales have moved back to restaurants. And the other thing that is happening is altogether, restaurant and retail sales are just simply down a little bit. There's quite a bit of pressure on units and volume. Now, my theory about that is if you go out to a restaurant and you look at the meal prices, typically the protein that is included in any single meal is chicken. And the reason for that is one of the cheapest proteins. If you want to replace chicken with shrimp on your salad or on your pasta, there's typically a $5 or more surcharge. So for a long, long time, really any time that people eat out, they have been trained to think that seafood is a more premium and more expensive offering. Now, translate that into the retail environment where people are constantly balancing their time with taste, with what am I in the mood for, against that pocketbook. And all of a sudden, that more premium image that seafood has, I believe, stands in the way a little bit. Now, the one big exception to that has been fresh salmon. The fresh salmon pounds compared to pre-pandemic are incredible. They are still up double digits. Then you have to wonder, well, how is fresh salmon so different from the rest? Well, if you look into the merchandising in stores, you see a lot of education about the healthfulness of salmon, about the omega-3s, about the healthy fats in there, the lean protein of some of the other seafoods. So I still believe that the idea of nutrition, sustainability, a lean protein, those kinds of things are very important for seafood to focus on so that people have reasons to overcome their price image and their price perceptions and continue to engage with seafood as well.
Sounds like it makes a lot of sense, Anne-Marie. Thank you for that. Now, Anne-Marie, we have covered a lot of ground in grocery in these past few minutes. Can you tell us what are some key things, some key factors about grocery overall that we should be looking at in the coming months? What should our audience be keeping at top of mind if they want to stay on top of their game in their businesses, so to speak?
One of the hardest things in the current environment is that typically retailers were always able to control the vast majority of their own destination by pricing levels, by promotion levels, by execution in the store, and just really making it a destination that people wanted to go to. What has happened over the last 3 years is that the execution, the pricing, the promotions, they're all important, but the outside environment has gotten so much more of a grip on the success of the sales levels and the ability to grow year over year. And what I mean with that is exactly the kind of items that you covered earlier on in the newscast, and that is the inflationary levels. It is the consumer confidence. We have to keep in mind that at the end of the day, the US economy, 2/3 of it is driven by consumer spending. And if consumers aren't confident in their ability to spend and pay back, they are starting to pull back. Now, combine that with the fact that credit card debt is about to hit $1 trillion, the highest it's ever been, combined with the fact that a lot of the emergency allotments in SNAP were pulled out of the market as of March. So we're going to see a tremendous amount more pressure even on that dollar that we already have. Additionally, I think we have to keep in mind that, yes, month over month, inflation is moderating. But at the end of the day, we are looking at about 30% higher grocery prices today than we did pre-pandemic. And there's very few of our listeners or just consumers in general that are making 30% more compared to 2019. So that idea of pressure on income is real. But at the same time, every survey that I do and looking in the actual sales numbers, there is still a lot of opportunity out there to get people to open their wallets just a little bit more. Holidays are a really big one. So of course we have the big holidays, we have the secondary holidays, but are there some self-invented holidays like hot chili week or bread week, or, if you think about the watermelon national holidays, those types of things? What are some things that you can do to get people to celebrate and really pull out of that normal? Another one is a brand that they love. We see, of course, private brands do really well in the current environment, but at the same time, people are willing to spend a little bit more for a brand that they love. So that interaction between private brand and brands is really important. And then we see just convenience and time. When do people buy value added that has a better margin and a little bit of a higher rank? Well, that's when they're out of time, or they need a little bit of sanity to be able to take the kids to a soccer game and still put a meal on the table. So there's many ways in which retailers can continue to be a solution and part of that very hard puzzle that we're all dealing with. And I think therein really lies the opportunity to continue to drive growth in years to come.
All right, thank you for those insights. Anne-Marie Roerink, president of 210 Analytics. Anne-Marie, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we go, we're going to take a look at what's coming up in the food industry in the coming days. On May 20th to 21st, we have our big live stream collaboration with Nestle Professional at the National Restaurant Association show. The coverage starts at noon Eastern time both days. Don't miss that. There's a LATAM Food Talks featuring David Magana of Rabobank. On May 26th, the final numbers for May are released for the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index. And also on May 26th, the Bureau of Economic Analysis releases the latest data on personal consumption expenditures. And that is our show. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Susan Choi, and I do have some updates for you. First, due to the Memorial Day long weekend, there will be no newscast next week, but we will be back in action in June with a great guest, John Saxon, Chief of Staff of the Howard Hughes Corporation. He'll have insights on the real estate industry. That's on Friday, June 2nd. Don't miss that show. I also want to remind you to show us some love on social media. Like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channels. The support really makes a difference for us. Thanks again for tuning in. Have a great weekend and take care.